Hi everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on creating sustainable cities. I'm Sophie McGillivray, a graduate of the Bachelor of Architectural Design and a content producer here at RMIT University. So before we kick off today's discussion, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders, past, present and emerging. And while we conduct our work remotely, I want to pay my respect to the wider unceded lands of this nation. So today, over 4 billion people around the world live in cities, more than 50% of the global population. According to the UN, by 2050, twice as many people will live in cities as in rural areas. These densely populated cities offer opportunities for people. Well-managed urbanisation can improve access to education, healthcare and housing and increase productivity, but they also come with their own unique set of challenges. As urbanisation accelerates, there's a need to ensure that these areas will be sustainable, inclusive, safe and resilient for generations to come. So today we've assembled an expert panel of RMIT academics and researchers who are going to help us answer the question of how we can create more sustainable cities and the jobs involved in making that happen. So let's meet our panelists for today. So first up, Dr. Yazid Ninsalam. Welcome, Yazid. If you want to give yourself a brief intro.
Hi there. My name is Yazid. I am a lecturer in landscape architecture, and my research focuses on the impact of landscape transformation and competing pressures of urban development and climate variability on management of natural and built assets. So I'm currently working on a project with UN Habitat to enhance the resilience of capital city of Solomon Islands and its inhabitants to current and future climate impacts and natural disasters.
Wonderful, thank you, Yazid. It's great to have you with us. Next, we've got Dr. Heike Raman, not ramen like the noodles. So Heike, would you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. My name is Heike Rahman, and I'm a senior lecturer in landscape architecture at the School of Architecture and Urban Design at RMIT here. And my research predominantly focuses on the intersection between landscape architecture and urbanism, with a specific focus on design practices, technology and ecology. So I've done some work on researching dynamic landscapes in the Asian context predominantly. I have worked with design practices around the world in unpacking how digital technologies have informed and shaped and reshaped the landscape architectural practice. And recently I have sort of expanded that work a little bit with an understanding of how landscape architectural practices across Asia are starting to change in regard to the rapid changes that occurred over the last 50 years in particular.
Fantastic, thanks Heike, and really glad we could have you here with us. And welcome to Professor Lauren Rickards. Hi Lauren, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure, thank you Sophie. Yeah, hi everyone. So I am a human geographer and ecologist by training, and my work looks at the social dimensions of climate change. So that means all of the complexity and messy stuff about how we respond, or as it may be, don't respond. I'm one of the lead authors with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who you might have noticed released a big report this week. I'm actually in a separate working group to that, so the science has come out, and now our next one, which will come out in February, is about looking at impacts, vulnerability and adaptation. A lot of my research has looked particularly at some of those disasters and really tricky things, including things that don't even get counted as disasters like droughts. So now one of the things I get to do is to lead something called the Urban Futures Enabling Capability Platform, which is a big name for something which is about connecting people across different disciplinary silos. So I'm really interested in people having really dynamic conversations in a way that helps us to deal with what's often called the wicked issues of society. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Sophie.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lauren. That sounds really interesting. And finally, we've got Dr. Sebastian Diaz Gasker. Hi, Sebastian.
Hi, Sophie. Thank you for having me. And hi, everyone. I am a lecturer in music industry at the School of Media and Communication. I'm a ludomusicologist, which means that I'm a person who studies video game music. My main area of research is looking at how people interact with video games and music within digital spaces, and how they replicate those practices when they're not playing the game. So if you've ever listened to game music when you're not playing the game, why? So I pretty much look at that. I'm also a music engineer and an audio engineer and music producer. And I also specialize in popular music and ethnomusicology. So some of the research that I've been doing lately has been on COVID recovery, essentially, for the music industry, and trying to see how and why do we engage with music, how do we engage in the spaces in which music is made, and how do we do that when we're all locked up in 5-kilometer bubbles. So yeah, that's me.
Fantastic, thanks, Sebastian. And I would love to go to a gig, so I would love to hear your research on that. Welcome everyone, and thanks again for being here tonight. Just before we get started, I'll remind viewers that we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of our panel discussion to go over any questions from the audience. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A tool on the right of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. So cities are major contributors to climate change. According to UN Habitat, cities consume 78% of the world's energy and produce more than 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. As climate change proceeds, we need to think critically about how we should be responding. So Lauren, you were responsible for co-designing one of RMIT's courses called Climate Change Responses, which sees students creating climate change mitigation plans for different organisations. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sophie. So this is a course that's absolutely foundational to a couple of particular degrees, the Environment Society degree, which I want to give a shout out to, and we have Ben Cook ready to answer questions on the chat too. That's the social science aspects of environment, also urban and regional planning. But we also bring in students from right across the university, so it's a really great course for meeting others from different disciplines. And that's really, really important, because one of the key kind of principles of the course is that every job is a climate change job. So when we think about, what we need to be doing in the future, sometimes we think, oh, maybe, I need to have a job with sustainability in the job title. That's not the case anymore, particularly when it comes to climate change. Every single job has implications for the greenhouse gas emissions that we're collectively producing. So when we talk about a city producing it, that's actually people producing it through the practices, and usually often work practices that are involved, I should say, including digital ones, because although it seems virtual, it's got very strong connections along those wires to some pretty hefty energy sources. So thinking through these sorts of issues, the things we do in the course, I should say it's also deliberately designed to incorporate what's called climate resilience and adaptation, which I'm sure everyone here is aware of as well, which is to say we already have locked into the climate system now a really concerning degree of climate change. So we need to get very, very active in actually reducing the impacts of those climatic changes, because they don't just fall from the sky. They actually are co-created. They emerge out of the I kind of call it like the impact sandwich. It emerges out of what we're doing in particular circumstances. And so that's where adaptation comes in. We can do a whole lot to reduce the impacts of that. So the course looks at those things, and it does so in a way that's really engaged in the real world. So we have heaps of guest lecturers. We have heaps of people coming in that interviewed, including alumni, like recent graduates, talking about the work they're doing. And all of the assessments, as Sophie indicated, are about real world skills, like how do you write these plans? How do you assess these plans? And based on real organisations. So whether it's Telstra or a big supermarket, or whether it's a small refugee organisation, everyone needs to adapt, and we really try to enable students to embrace their interests. And I've got to say, sometimes, they've even led to such good assignments that we send them to those organisations, and that really creates real world change right there, as well as a couple of jobs down the line as well can come out of it too.
Yeah, wonderful. And so what were some of the organisations that they worked with, Lauren, and what were some of the solutions that I guess that they came up with?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the assignments often have been, so when we look at the existing climate change adaptation plans, one of the main groups in society that have been most active have been local governments. So basically most local governments now have some form of climate change mitigation adaptation plan, but also some of the big banks as well. And I know from other work I do with my research hat on that they are pedaling really, really fast to catch up on this whole climate change thing, as well as big groups and corporations like Coles, for example. And so in terms of kind of thinking through the solutions, I've got to say most of the existing type solutions are what we call incremental. So they're kind of making a small dent. So for example, Coles has been putting solar across some of those massive, massive rooftops it has. So that's, you know, a really great thing. There's a very, very strong focus on energy emissions. So that's good, but we actually need to start looking much more widely at all sorts of things. So for example, thinking about energy, it's not just about the source of energy at the end of that electricity wire, it's the fact that all the conductors, all those wires generate greenhouse gases that are actually thousands of times more potent for the climate than the ones being produced at. So we've got to start thinking really cleverly, and at base, we've got to stop moving stuff around the world for no reason as much as we do, and stop consuming so much. So that's
absolutely
the answer.
So got to stop getting my mandarins shipped in from Thailand.
Absolutely, with a plastic package that was made from Australian resources that was sent across to China, that was produced, and then exactly. I mean, just look at Chipageddon and the fact that, you know, Taiwan's drought has caused this massive shortage and things. You start to see the kind of crazy globalized knots that we've created.
Yeah, great, wonderful. Thanks, Lauren. And Yazid, I will pass over to you. So you spoke about working with UN Habitat to enhance the resilience of Solomon Islands to climate impacts and natural disasters. What does enhancing resilience actually look like in practice? Is it different from place to place? And as a landscape architect, which professionals are you working alongside in creating these more resilient cities?
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, so landscape architects, we do heaps of things, and broadly speaking, the profession itself is very diverse, as you've kind of mentioned. So we look into contributing to finding solutions to 21st century problems of urbanization. So this includes climate change, environmental disasters, inequity and poverty, pollution, environmental degradation, and public health and well-being. And it in itself offers to a whole lot of different kind of stakeholders, for example, state, local government bodies, and we as landscape architects kind of also contribute to commercial practice from large to small projects, and also in the context of international development sector. So the project in Honiara that we are looking at basically allows us to kind of conceive, reimagine, and transform the way in which the outside world kind of look at public open spaces, for example, streetscapes. This kind of looks at places like parks to playgrounds. We also work with different engineers looking at transport solutions to help develop tourism strategies, for example. Back in 2019, I conducted a class, a design class in Solomon Islands, in Honiara, with the Solomon Island National University students to envision a livable Honiara. So basically, we began to identify root causes of places that may be vulnerable by carrying out spatial mappings. And also the outcome of the work were disseminated to local stakeholders so that they are able to see how the communities themselves are able to kind of communicate ideas of change that needs to be forwarded. At the same time, we also conducted design studios in Melbourne. So the students at RMIT, they worked remotely looking at all the spatial data that was collected and also the inputs from the local graduates to develop design solutions or propositions so that we are able to kind of address issues that have been kind of raised.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks, Yazid. And Just a quick reminder for anyone that may have just joined us that our live Q&A tool is open, so please submit your questions in the chat function on the right and we'll try and answer them at the end of the discussion. So a smart city uses information and communication technology to collect data. Insights gained from this data are used to manage assets, resources and services more efficiently, raising the standard of living for inhabitants while promoting sustainability. So I'll put this out to anyone on the panel. What do you think are some of the opportunities and challenges of developing smart cities? And actually, if anyone just wants to kind of elaborate on what a smart city is, because it's a term that gets used a lot at the moment.
Sophie, I'll jump in just while others gather their thoughts, if you like. So the pros and cons of smart cities, this is a big debate. So the pros, the idea of a smart city is that we use sensors and a whole lot of other observation type technologies to have just-in-time information flows, which allows us to make smarter decisions. And things like, let's say, floods or emerging disasters can mean that this is extremely important. They also have more everyday applications, such as helping to manage traffic flows and things like this. So really, it's about kind of looking at for more efficient, optimal ways of doing things. On the con side, two main things. One is that any technological solution tends to involve electrification, and electrification comes with sustainability challenges, so they need to be addressed, similar to what I mentioned earlier. Also, resilience challenges. So I just did a big piece of work for a certain group, a certain government group, and we looked at cross-sectoral critical infrastructure resilience. So that's to say there's about 11 different major infrastructure systems that we all rely on for our everyday kind of lives to kind of function on in the background. Infrastructure is that stuff in the background that just, and at the heart of the vulnerability of those in the face of climate change is the electricity sector, which is hugely vulnerable to a range of climate change issues. So, so the idea that we can kind of electrify everything and keep it all going works up until when it doesn't. And then we're kind of like have these centralized like mass blackouts type thing. And anyone, from the Dandenongs cockatoo might have an insight into the joys of centralized electricity systems. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that there's some civil rights and democracy issues that need also to be resolved. Smart often comes with surveillance. And so there's some real governance issues there. And these are the sorts of things that, shout out to some of my colleagues. In the Centre for Urban Research, we have a group there called Critical Urban Governance. This is precisely the sorts of things that they grapple with and try to contribute useful feedback back to policymakers.
Yeah, great. So we do want to avoid creating an Orwellian future for ourselves whilst creating a sustainable future. Does anyone else want to jump in on that topic of smart cities?
Yeah, totally. I think particularly on the last point, the surveillance aspect is an interesting point as well. Sort of as we have started to see sort of how people use the space in understanding already. I mean, previously we had the discussion with the surveillance camera and safety and security in space, but now it's a much more fine-grained underlying sort of thing where the data is not as obviously collected. It's actually much more hidden in that part. Sort of how do you start to consent into participating in these environments? But as well, there's a lot of other stuff. And I know particular places in Asia that use that smart technology quite extensively in regard to understanding health and well-being on a positive side as well, sort of collecting the data on understanding how people use space, how they could engage with certain facilities that would be put in place as well. So as part of an encouragement and as part of an interaction among people as well. So there are, as Lauren rightly pointed out, a lot of important aspects in there, but the data governance is certainly an incredibly important aspect in that domain. From a landscape perspective, I think using or from any built environment perspective, using data or designing with data is an incredibly interesting aspect. I think the eventual consequence of that is only what do you do with that data? And to what extent is the volume of data necessary to achieve a better outcome in the way that we design or plan cities eventually. So there might be a critical point where we just say, well, this is actually data that is incredibly useless. It doesn't lead to better outcomes. And another point that I would like to raise in discussion is from perspective of design as well, this point of saying, well, we can't rely entirely on the data to tell us what the best outcome is. We still need to have the critical head on. We still have to design and plan with a critical human understanding of the situation surrounding it. So it's that's probably the danger by fetishizing big data too much and smart cities in that case, that often comes with that detriment to take away the critical thinking that's still required.
Yeah, great. And yeah, so it's interesting that you say that. It almost becomes like the data is driving this rather than it being a human-centered design sort of object. Yeah, it's really interesting. All right, so this next question is for Sebastian. Few places have undergone radical urban transformation like the Colombian city of Medellin. Plagued by drug-related violence in the 80s and 90s, it was once known as one of the most dangerous cities in the world. But over the last 20 years, it's undergone an urban transformation. With an improved public transport system, major investments in public infrastructure and improved access to social services, it's been called the Silicon Valley of South America and the world's smartest city. In addition, in 2015, it was named a UNESCO City of Music. So, Sebastian, how have the arts and specifically music helped drive social transformation in Medellin and other cities?
Cool, thanks. I'd say that first, by the way, context. So I am originally Colombian, so it's interesting to see how this transformation happened. Although, what I'd say is probably more than the arts themselves. It was more public policy that kind of guided and dictated like all this whole transformation. So kind of what happened in Medellin. So Medellin had of course, it was. There was a lot of drug violence. There was a lot of gangs. This is 80s, so it's ages ago. But what kind of happened was that you start seeing this social innovation around a lot of progressive politicians that start saying, you know what, we need to change several things in the city, and one of them was infrastructure. So infrastructure went into, you need to get a cable car which connects all the kind of city center with the outer communes. You get a modernized roads, and you just essentially have to close that city suburb divide. And once they started doing that, you started seeing like a very, very, very interesting flow of people. Areas that were just marginalized and that were just informal suburbs and settlements became part of the city. So movements of people played a very important role. What they also did was that they had didn't nationalize because it wasn't a national thing, but essentially the city ran all its infrastructure. So it was all public. So everything from your services, utilities, transport, everything. And then they start actually sending all this to other parts of the country and other parts of Latin America. So this public enterprise started working as a private company in different places. So it was a very good use of resources. But the important thing that they did was that they first connected the city. They really put a lot of public funding into work essentially. And then they use that to drive policy of, okay, we're going to reinvent a lot of spaces around culture and art and music. So what they did was that they used arts to engage youth. They used arts to create belonging within spaces. And they use art as an outlet for a lot of people to just like, instead of, like you're going to like join a gang or something or whatever, join a dance group, join a music group. And this essentially is what kind of led to this whole transformation that you can say culminated in like 2015 when they went into when they were listed a city of music by UNESCO. Oddly enough, Melbourne has not been named a city of music. Adelaide has. We gotta fix that.
Yeah.
So yeah, like why? But it's I mean, it's also like Adelaide has some really cool things going for it. But what they invested all that money from all the infrastructure, from the public funding, what they did was that they created new public policies to strengthen existing musical and artistic ecosystems. So they didn't replace them, just going, how do we make this better? They boosted the musical scene. They created free public spaces in which people could enjoy the arts and music. And they really pumped a lot of resources into heritage building and into training for essentially musicians. So what happens here in Melbourne? It's very similar to what happened in Medellin, but the thing is that like in Melbourne, we have a very strong cultural scene here already. And Melbourne's long-standing music legacy has seen that many musical venues didn't turn into just pokey pubs. They just went into like actual proper music scenes. So we've got things like the SP, we've got things like the Tote, we've got the Old Bar, many places that have become just very important music venues. And also one thing that we have here is that we also have a lot of public policy towards arts. So there was one that was called the Agent for Change legislation that happened a few years ago, in which that protected music venues from noise complaints. So every single time that you hear something like, oh, there's like a noise complaint or something, you can probably maybe blame the person who built the house for not putting like proper sound insulation. Little things like that kind of make a city more livable, in which you can be in your house and not like have like all the ruckus of like everything happening, and you can still go downstairs. So you can go 2-3 blocks down to your local venue and listen to some music. So there's a lot of things that happen within Melbourne that kind of mirrored what happened in Medellin. Can more be done? Yes, especially things like making the music industry sustainable. But that's, I guess, like a whole like bigger conversation of like how do we make more secure income for artists, and just changing public notions of arts. But yes, I'm rambling, so yes.
No, it's all very, very interesting. Thanks, Sebastian. So we'll move on to our next question, just because we've got a lot to get through. The seasonal calendars of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people represent significant Indigenous biocultural knowledge. The people of the Kulin Nation have identified 7 annual seasons in our local area. So right now in Melbourne, for all of us, we're experiencing Guling, hopefully I'm saying that right, or orchid season, which is marked by orchids flowering, wattle bursting into colour, and koalas bellowing at night. Which I personally haven't heard, but I can imagine. So Heike, why do you think working in partnership with Aboriginal peoples is so important to the discipline of landscape architecture and to building a more sustainable city in general?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I guess it's a very fundamental point, and I think a very important aspect to consider, I think, in every business that we do, whether it's landscape or whether it's any other business, actually, to understand that we are working and living on this land that is inhabited for tens of thousands of years, and there is knowledge in that cultural practice that we have for a long time not acknowledged and not registered. So I think that's in the university environment already. The Reconciliation Action Plan, I think, acknowledged, and I think more and more businesses go into that domain. From a landscape perspective, that relationship to Indigenous community is incredibly important, because as a built environment professional, as professionals, we will actively work with land, we work with culture, we work with place, we work with history, with people, with natural systems, and build context. So all of the work actually relates to the environment in which Indigenous knowledge is actually incredibly important to, first of all, acknowledge, but also there is a rich source of knowledge that we can learn from and incorporate into our new ways of understanding natural and lived environments in a way. And that is sort of somehow in contrast to the Western notion of understanding systems, engineering approaches and so on, in terms of that very sensitive way of managing and harnessing and looking after and caring for land that with our practices certainly we have ignored and sometimes exacerbated the detrimental consequences that we're facing now, whether it's fires or whether it's floodings or whether it's other disasters that occur in this country. But moreover, there is this kind of understanding with the relationship that comes from that cultural perspective of the stories, the narratives, that kind of deep connection to place and to people, that cultural notation that forms the places that we live in and forms our society in a way. So from a landscape perspective, that is an incredibly important and rich relationship that is in the landscape program at RMIT has a long tradition already. I think it dates back to the 1990s when Jim Sinatra, a landscape architect here in Melbourne, started his engagement and had this fantastic initiative with elders in the Kimberley Ranges and starting to bring students up to participate in the 19-kilometre walk, the Lodera Dreaming Trail. And since then, with a couple of years interruption, actually, our students have been able to walk that trail, listen to the stories, deeply engaging with an understanding of the natural environment and the processes that are incredibly enriching to our work. And since then, sort of, you had the slide at the beginning with, I think it was Jock Gilbert's studio. That was one of the more recent practices where landscape architecture staff right now are embedded in a longer term collaboration with Indigenous communities, both here in Melbourne, but also in other places around the country, in Victoria and New South Wales. And setting up that dialogue, that relationship really that comes from listening and working, listening about stories, but also working on the ground in the landscape.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks, Heike. And yeah, it's really great to hear that our landscape architecture students are engaging in a really meaningful way with Indigenous people on whatever they work on. So I'll throw out the next question to everyone on the panel. What are some of the changes you'd like to see implemented in the City of Melbourne to ensure it's a safe, resilient and vibrant place to live for future generations? So whoever would like to jump in first, please feel free. Yazid, I'm going to nominate you.
I'm pretty new to Melbourne. Only been here for 4 years. But I guess one of the key things is this idea of safety that kind of is derived with being comfortable with your environment. So I think as designers and also as contributors to this built space, ideas around how you might be able to kind of contribute to the city generally kind of stems from how safe or how comfortable you are in terms of being part of the process of building the city in itself. So I guess one of the key things that I'd like to see would probably be enhancing the qualities of public open spaces, and so that people are able to be confident with where they are. So that's really important for me and for my kid, of course. Yeah.
I might also jump into that one as well. With I think for me, I see it on a different lens, because for someone in the music industry, sustainability is really linked with livability and being able to enjoy life and the setting that you're in. So this is one of the things that we actually look in the Bachelor of Arts music industry in which I'm in which how do we, especially now after COVID, how do we reinvent the current structures that we have socially to be able to make something more sustainable? So for example, if you, anyone in the music industry would say like, how can we make life and your career more sustainable for, like as a musician or someone in the music industry? You find people just go universal basic income, done. Like that would just solve a lot of issues, and people would just be able to dedicate themselves to what they want to do. Actually, I remember in 2018, the Greens put out a policy that was called the Living Arts Fund. And what it meant, what it wanted to do was something that is actually replicated in various cities around the world. That is that if you're an artist or a musician, what they'll do is that they will, the government will kind of subsidize your part of your wage. So if you're not making minimum wage, the government will actually top up everything that you make to so you can make minimum wage. Of course, like this actually came with strings. Like you have to produce art or music. You have to contribute artistically. And this will just like something like this in which you can just say, well, the systems that we're creating or the livability or the enjoyability of a space is not just making it safe, secure, not precarious, sustainable. So that's one thing that will probably like just help. That is just making the industries and the jobs that we actually have around various industries properly sustainable in the way that like these you can see a future in them. Probably something else that would probably add would be like better internet, probably for all of us here in Australia, because the NBN and of course in the music industry right now through like streaming stuff and everything, that's been a challenge as well. So something that will future-proof our city, that will actually help to like have like really robustly stand all these systems that we're implementing will be better internet infrastructure. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess picking up on these points, particularly coming back to Yazid's points on the safety as well. I guess for me, what I would like to see is a greater awareness, a systematic approach to urban design that incorporates health and well-being, and that includes to me climate resilience as well, how we engage with an increasingly hotter environment, for example, and that not just by improving building design, but also understanding that part of our life, as we understand now being in lockdown again, is actually happening outdoors, outside. So how can we improve the way that we design the cities in catering both for a better climatic response, but also for mental well-being.
I know that being in lockdown myself, taking my dog to the local dog park, which is developers are very, very keen to get their hands on, has been absolutely paramount to me maintaining my sanity during lockdown. So I feel ya. So this one, again, to everyone on the panel, this is a really interesting question, I think. What advice would you give to somebody who's passionate about seeing their city become a more sustainable place, but really isn't sure where to start? But I might start with you, Lauren.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, that question about things are so big, where do I focus my attention is something that, everybody I think is grappling with. Just to start by saying that, this kind of question of where to start really points to the need to have a kind of really big sort of systems perspective on a lot of this. And certainly that's kind of what we try to teach in the quite general degree environment society, as to how to understand all of these interconnections. So coming back to that question of what sort of city, do we want to see, what would we change? I mean, for me, it would be really addressing the privileging of private property, which is at the heart of so many questions, whether it's about the neglect and injustices for Australian Aboriginal groups, or whether it's about the incredible wealth disparities and income disparities that mean that owning your own home is out of reach. Not to mention the high-rise kind of blight on a lot of our CBD as well. So, sorry, you can't hear that yelling. So what I would suggest is that people choose a generalist kind of degree, which gives them the space and all of the ingredients, the sort of smorgasbord, if you like, to actually start thinking this through. And then you can always become more specialist in a postgraduate subsequent course. So I'm a big advocate for broad undergrad courses. Yeah.
Great. And do you think that, and Lauren, just to dovetail off what you just said, do you think that in talking about those broad generalist degrees, do you think that people who want to take action on climate change, do you think that they need to have kind of a science background, or do you think there are other skills that are just as important?
Very much just as important to have a whole range of other skills. Having said that, all of us need to, we have a responsibility to become more climate literate, to understand how the physical world works. But you don't need to actually go to university and study science per se to get that. And I'm sure most people who finish, secondary school would have a pretty good basis in that. What I would say is that it takes effort to actually focus any sort of degree onto the question of climate change. It's about selecting the sorts of courses, the sort of institution you are doing quite carefully. You could choose, there's a very, very large number of courses you could choose in the Australian higher education sector, which should be taught from a climate change lens, but are not. So this is leading up to a bit of a plug for RMIT, where we have a high-level institution-wide commitment, not just to climate change, but to the broader Sustainable Development Goals, which we're trying to infuse in everything we do, how the institution runs, everything we teach, everything we research. Because the Sustainable Development Goals, as you might know, the 17 big ticket items for the globe to kind of actually try to get back on track, really cover so much. It doesn't actually really cut stuff out. What it does is say we have to think about how we do things. So you can still go and study marketing and business and fashion and automotive engineering, but it's how you're doing it and why you're doing it that's really important.
Yeah, and I might just chip in there as part of the conversation, saying, well, understanding what your passion is and what you the mode of working that you appreciate and that you like. So that kind of understanding whether it is in the science, then that might be the direction that it might be taking. But as Lauren was pointing out, it's actually happened across multiple range of disciplines. That includes, for instance, the design aspect as well. So if that's an environment that you feel more comfortable and passionate about in terms of the mode of working, then in that case, you can procure a career in that domain as well and equally achieve change. I think the most important part there is sort of certainly the passion, and the second thing is, despite all the seriousness, to not lose track and just focus on the immediate change, because it is unfortunately a long process, and it needs to be an enjoyable process as well. And as we know that it is much easier to engage in conversations if they are not confrontational in a way, and we allow different voices to be on the table. So in that case, then that kind of I wouldn't say fun, but well, a career should be fun. So certainly it should be fulfilling as well. So if you find that you're constantly working to a goal that is not achievable and to standards that are not achievable and getting frustrated, then you're not achieving anything for the greater greater good, and you're getting burnt out along the way. So the passion, but also having a sense of fun despite the sense of urgency is certainly my recommendation in this case.
And I guess just also allowing yourself to kind of celebrate the small wins along the way, rather than just sort of going, this is what we need to hit, and there's no point in celebrating until we get there.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing as well, sort of saying, well, where do you want to make change? At what level is that occurring? And for some disciplines, it's happening more on an implementation level, on a smaller level, but the increments itself sort of add up to the bigger picture. Or is it larger strategic changes that you'd start to inform and be interested in? So there's a range of varieties, and it depends on, celebrating the smaller steps along the way.
Yes.
And Sophie, can I just build on that just quickly to say too that, you know, it's not a sort of a single selection here, either in terms of what you're studying or what work you do. And one of the things that I think really, I've worked in different universities that RMIT is characterised by is having researchers and academic lecturers who actually have their feet in different industries and different sectors. And so people now have these much more hybrid careers, and you can have much more hybrid studying experiences. So you could do another course and come and study climate change responses. You can, you know, this not also, I don't mean to forget to say that there's all the informal connections between students as well. And they're a really, really core part of what we do at the university. They're driving a lot of climate action at RMIT. There's a whole lot of stuff you can do. And I think, one of the things I really enjoy about working at RMIT is it does provide all of these different outlets for people to be like a whole person and say, this is my passion. And certainly I've never worked with such passionate teaching staff before who are just driven by this commitment to making a better world, and have had quite varied careers. So it's not just a single shot. It's not the Olympics.
Yeah, well, that's really nice to hear as well, Lauren. So I could keep talking about this, but we'll move on because we've got quite a few questions from people coming through. So I guess, do we think Australia, so we've got one question here, do we think Australia has smart cities already, or do you think we still have quite a way to go in this respect? It's a big question.
I'm happy to chip into this question. I guess in the context of smart cities, I'm coming from Singapore and how Singapore has kind of developed this idea of actually managing both the need of looking at objects and information. Basically, for me, smart cities is the management of objects and information and how it might be able to contribute to the discussion of how we might be able to build up resilience or understand changes that needs to be done in order to kind of achieve the aims and the goals of the city in itself. So I guess the question is, to what extent is Australia able to define certain targets or certain kind of understanding of how we might be able to use those available information and the associated objects, which would give you that understanding of how we might use them, how we might change them. For example, looking at the urban forestry kind of strategy in city of Melbourne, where the aims of reaching 40% tree canopy cover over a certain period of time is the goal. So having a very clear question about how we might be able to use information to inform our next steps is the main thing. So the context of Australia or any other city in the world being able to utilize this or engage with this concept of smart cities is dependent on how we define the questions in order to create those cities livable and sustainable in our day-to-day. So I guess that's one of the key things that we might be able to kind of think about, especially when it stems to idea of smart cities and virtual doppelgangers and things like that. Yeah, the question is really important, and that in itself would enable us to be able to kind of chart the future of how we might be able to utilize both information and the objects that we manage in our day-to-day.
And I know, I know, Yazid, that in Melbourne, there already is sort of an initiative where you can adopt a tree, and so you can kind of, I guess the idea is that people and citizens kind of have this more intimate relationship with the natural environment around them. Do you think that Melbourne kind of already is on its way to becoming a smart city, or?
Definitely, it is. Looking at how we are able to kind of socialize this idea of ownership with the natural environment is really important. Using ideas of how long a tree's kind of life expectancy would be needed or is required, requires us to kind of create engagement or conversations with communities where the trees kind of is embedded or belong to. So being able to kind of be informed of certain ideas and certain kind of processes through this idea of having an overview of the data sets that we collect would enable us to kind of engage in such conversations more broadly on a governance level or down to the individual level, whereby we are able to kind of empathize or resonate with certain objects or certain assets that is part of the city in itself. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, and we've got another question here. So Sebastian, this one's for you. What is the recovery of the music industry going to look like for Melbourne?
Oof, that's going to be very interesting. There's a lot of different levels in which like the music industry is actually recovering every single time that we're out of lockdown. There's a really interesting research called the COVID audience tracker, in which what has apparently been happening is that every single time that we go into lockdown, every time that people get surveyed and everyone's just dying to go somewhere. So people want to go to places, people want to see people, they want to be in spaces where people are. So there's this so yeah, but we can't do that now. So what's happening? So two things are happening. One, when we go out of lockdown, we do have to manage things like how do we get to places? How do we ensure that an event that we actually want to go to is actually going to happen, because who knows, maybe lockdown. So right now there's this conversation happening in the media and in different circles of, can we actually have a government-funded insurance scheme in which the government underwrites events that are going to happen, and boom, they get cancelled. So that way, like if it does get cancelled, then we don't end up with a lot of people who just lost work, just lost a lot of money. Just suddenly events don't become like are not profitable. So that's one thing. If we want to be able to maintain live venues, we need to make sure that there is the incentive for people to actually hold these events despite there being and probably an imminent lockdown. And that's, of course, like until we all get vaccinated, and that's actually what we're facing. Because the COVID audience tracker actually shows that what is happening is that people are buying tickets during lockdown for events in the future. So that's good. So people are actually like putting money towards this and events that will probably happen, because we don't have that certainty anymore. But what we do have certain is that there are events that will happen online. So we just had Splendor X that just happened. I actually missed it. But I was actually told that was pretty cool. There's been some events that are happening in many online spaces. So I remember having a conversation with some members of the panel a while ago, in which I actually mentioned that the Substation, which is my local venue, they actually recreated the entire substation, like the exterior and the interior, in Minecraft. And you could actually log into Minecraft and go to the substation and attend a gig. So everyone who has seen a gig on Fortnite or any other kind of like video game will also see that like these things are eventually happening. So and also many of us also saw Isolate and saw whatever Instagram gig from our favorite artist. Now, what we need to do is to what we need to do now is to train musicians to be able to do that and generate revenue for them to actually like have like some sustainable like work, and also for it to look cool, something that is like attractive for audiences. So that's something that we're actually looking at within our course and plug, of course, the Bachelor of Arts Music Industry, in which many of our students actually look at how do we create sustainable, ethical events, or even things like merch. We have one student this semester who is doing who is going to set up a business on just doing sustainable, ethical band merch. So even like little initiatives like that. So just kind of to echo what Lauren was saying before, and then Heike was saying before, it's all like, you don't need to be a scientist. You don't need to be in the sciences to know about these things or to act on these things. One thing that you can do, of course, is vote someone that will actually probably maybe commit to a 2020 to 2050 targets. But we might like what we need to also look at is how do we all, when we're creating systems, when we're creating industry, when we're creating jobs, when we're creating businesses or our own initiatives, how can we make it sustainable and how can we make it better for everyone?
Great, thanks, Sebastian. And we are sort of running out of time, but let me see if there are any more questions from our audience that have come through. I think that is basically it. So we're out of time for today. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody, and a huge thank you to the speakers, Heike, Yazid, Lauren, and Sebastian. Thanks for being here. And if you're interested in finding out more, remember to check out the other live events that are happening on our Open Day platform throughout August. And you can register for the main online event on Sunday, August 29th by visiting openday.rmit.edu.au. And we hope to see you at RMIT soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.